to try to rescue what's left of this planet we've got. One of the major issues, and probably not talked about enough over the years, has been biodiversity and how biodiversity fits in with the carbon picture, because they are absolutely intertwined, whether it be on the sea or on the land. We've got a panel today, part in person and part virtual, who are going to try and help us explore what possibilities there are for action, and what's coming out of the COP and what we might be likely to see in future. So we're going to start with Rain Newton-Smith, from the CBI, Chief Economist of the CBI. Rain.
Thank you so much, Roger. And I think thank all of you for joining us here in the room and also online. And I think for me, this really is a blend of both a very personal and professional passion. I grew up as a child, both in the kind of wilderness of the hills in the Eppant Hills in Powys in mid Wales, and also in Canada, in the lakes around Muskoka. And so my passion for nature and the natural world really did start early, perhaps a little to the despair of my parents, as I would return from collecting tadpoles or newts completely covered in mud. But I think the thing, as you were saying, Roger, that really saddens me is even over my lifetime, we've seen such a denigration of the natural world around us. You know, I think we're now all too familiar with some of the statistics. You know, the world's population of mammals, reptiles, fish, you know, have reduced by around 70%, you know, over the past 50 years. And I think it's so poignantly set out in Sir David Attenborough's witness statement in terms of what he has physically seen in his lifetime. And I think you can couple that with there have been some real success stories. I think the one that resonates with me most is there are now red kites, a very iconic bird in the UK, which fly over my children's play, you know, above their school all the time. Whereas when I was growing up, there were only a few breeding pairs, and they were reintroducing them into mid Wales. But I think, unfortunately, the overarching narrative over the past few decades has been of biodiversity loss. And I think one of the things that I have found as an economist is, you know, I also developed a passion for economics as a young teen. That sounds slightly disturbing, I appreciate. But for me, it was really the language of policy and how we work together to raise living standards and opportunities for everyone. But I actually sort of fell out of love with the profession as a young adult and through my professional life, because it became so removed from, you know, the role of human beings and our impact on climate, on biodiversity. And there felt like there's been a real failure of economics to put a value on nature around us. But I think for me, and I am an optimist, we were talking earlier about this, is I am now starting to see a real change in that. And I think it really started 15 years ago in the UK with the Stern Review, which really set out the benefits, which we now all accept, of early action on climate change. And obviously in the UK, that led to the emergence of some of the governance we need here, the UK Committee on Climate Change, which really has paved the way, I think, to the UK's success in reducing carbon emissions and our energy use to renewable sources by over half. You know, we've reduced our carbon emissions by 50% on 1990 levels, and we know we've got so much further to go. But I think more recently we are now starting to see nature come back into the fore. And again, in the UK, we saw the Dasgupta review a couple of years ago, where into the economics of biodiversity. And Professor Dasgupta, you know, very clearly said nature must be at the heart of economics. And for me, I absolutely agree. And we're now hearing businesses talk about their impact on nature, on the environment. We're talking about measuring natural capital in the decisions that governments make. And to my mind, nature is the very definition of social value. And I think this process is starting to restore my own faith in economics. And I think in the past, and it's been cemented, I think, in the past few days, that we're now in this sort of final stage of the transformation where nature is now beginning to be at the heart of business as well. Because I think we all know if we didn't have nature, there would be no economy, no growth, no quality of life. And, the World Economic Forum, many others, over 70% of the world, even narrow definitions of GDP rely on nature in some, either directly or indirectly. And so I think it's really encouraging that, now as the CBI, the representative British business, we're able to, have a discussion about nature and biodiversity, whereas I think 10 years ago, that would have just felt like it's completely from left field. And that's why, for me, I'm so encouraged that we now have businesses who are really making significant commitments. I'm really excited to hear from Anna and from Tesco's and Angela from WWF about the partnership that they've made on, measuring the impact of the average shopper's basket on the environment. And in the process this year, we've been leading the B7 organizations, our sister federations across the G7 countries. And our paper on climate also really talked about nature and biodiversity. And I think we called for three really important things is, first of all, we need to have targets around conserving nature and our oceans. And I think we've seen some good announcements here. It was great to see at COP26, we had over 130 nations covering 90% of global forests have committed to ending deforestation by 2030. And that needs to be followed by the action to make sure that happens. I think secondly, we've seen really important developments around metrics and measurement. So we now have the task force on nature-related disclosures, and their aim is to do for nature and our impact on the environment what the task force on climate-related disclosures have done for climate. And again, last week in Glasgow, we saw the international accounting standards say that they will also look at global standards on measuring our impact on the environment. And it feels like there's a real coalition of the willing is really growing. We've got over 100 UK businesses signed up to nature positive commitments. I'm under no illusion that we've got more to do. We need to think about how we develop markets that really put nature, the value of nature and biodiversity at that. We need to think about nature-based solutions in climate. But for me, I think just the fact we are having this discussion today really emphasizes, how far we've come. And I think there's so much to do. But for me, I'm so excited that this has become something that businesses and government are really talking about and starting to really tackle. But we are at the beginning, the foothills of that mountain to climb.
There have been a number of major organisations commit to protecting nature. I just wonder how many of them rely on offsetting, which, as you know, is incredibly controversial. Do you have any kind of index of that or a feel for it? How much is offsetting going to have to soak up?
I mean, I don't think we do yet. And one of the real challenges is we just don't have enough of the sort of data of, of businesses' impact on the environment. And
do you think it's possible to get that much data on a granular level with farms all around the world being so different?
I think technology, I think we're never going to have perfect data, but it's improving, and there are certainly things we can do. Companies can look at what their water use is, right? You can look and understand what is your water use at the moment and what happens to your waste. Where does it go? Where does it end up? And I think one of the things about technology is we can look at thermal satellite imagery, right, to see where forests are burning, for example, right? And we can use that data in a way that we weren't able to do that. So I think it means two things. One, it's easier for a business to measure their impact on the environment, and then it's also easier for us to have ways of checking that their data is right, that they're doing what they say. And deforestation, I think, is a really good example of that, right? We can use satellite imagery to actually see what's happening with the forest, to see whether that, businesses and governments are following through on their commitments.
Is it useful to be gathering this sort of data when we know we've got to cut emissions 5 times faster and 50% by 2030? Is this the time to be gathering data, or can we not progress unless we have the data?
I think you need the data and the action. So I don't think it's that we sort of need to wait, gather all the data and then decide what we're going to do about it. I think you need to start thinking about, how do I make, in my business, how do I minimize the water I'm using right from the start? How do I impact, what is happening with any pollution runoff from my business? So you have to start with the behavior change and the targets now. I don't think we can wait. But I also really fundamentally believe that, as we've seen with climate, we can't just ignore biodiversity and focus only on carbon emissions, because it really is a twin emergency. And if we focus solely on carbon emissions and don't think about the impact on nature of some of the renewable energy, for example, then we're just going to end up with a different crisis in 5 or 10 years' time. So I really think we need to look at the two together and figure out solutions that help us improve biodiversity loss and reduce carbon emissions at the same time, and not just focus on the trade-off between.
Okay, thank you very much. I have to say I credit you with the first, for me, time I ever heard the phrase when I became really interested in economics as an early teen. I have never ever heard that phrase before.
I might have been a little bit older. There might have been a little, maybe I was in my 20s. But right. Still sad.
Okay. So we're now going to hear from Camilla Dreyer from Accenture, who are one of the sponsors of the sponsor of the meeting, and she's going to come into us virtually somehow. Are you there?
Yes.
Yeah,
hello.
I can see her.
Hello. Shoot.
Can you see me?
Hi, Camilla.
Hi, nice to see you.
We're waiting.
Camilla, can we hear?
We're waiting for you to say hello and talk.
Okay. All right. Well, thank
Could
you
we have
very
the volume
much
up
for that introduction. I was asked to just open the panel discussion today with some reflection on what you already sort of touched on, Rain, around why business ought to care about nature in the first place. And I think you sort of slipped it into some of your opening remarks. But I think it's a very simple and basic truth that if we have no nature, we have no business. It's kind of true for all of us, whether we represent big businesses or small businesses, that in one way or the other, we're very much reliant either directly or via our supply chains on nature, natural capital, and ecosystem services. And in fact, going back to the economists on the panel, we've heard from the WEF that they estimate that up to $44 trillion of economic value generation is directly or heavily dependent on nature. That's more than half the world's GDP. And so that, of course, is not just an environmental crisis waiting to happen, but also very much a social and economic crisis, and one that business has a real and vested interest in stepping up to. And so whilst it's super positive and very welcome that we've seen, I think, nearly 3/4 of the FTSE 100 make these net zero aligned commitments and goals, our own Accenture annual CEO study, which we published with the UNGC, and it came out just yesterday, surveyed 1,200 CEOs across the world, 21 different industries, and asked them really about their perspectives on business and climate change. And what was really interesting to me in that study published yesterday was that just 21% of CEOs, 1 in 5, see biodiversity loss as a risk to their business. So that feels very out of whack with that WEF assessment of the economic value at stake and how business really perceives that issue. Only 7% of them said that they're already engaged or using advanced nature-based solutions. As you already touched on, Rain, it's very much a twin crisis, this thing around climate change and biodiversity loss. They're inextricably linked. We cannot disentangle one from the other. Climate change is a key driver of biodiversity loss, and vice versa. We'll never have a stable climate without nature, and we won't have thriving nature and biodiversity without that stable climate. So, of course, it's really positive news what we've heard over the last 2 weeks in Glasgow and before, although importantly, we do have some way to go even on climate to get to that 1.5 to stay at life safe levels of warming. But at least on carbon and climate change, the argument seems to have been won. However, with nature, it feels like very much we're at the beginning of the journey, and a place where we still really need to establish the case for nature and to raise awareness and understanding amongst the business community of the fact that biodiversity loss is a real risk to business and poses possibly an even bigger threat to us as humanity, reaching further into our lives, our livelihoods, and being in many ways much more irreversible. So in terms of this twin crisis, I think we've made some progress on the climate side of the house. Nature has really been very much the poor relation in that equation, getting much less time, attention, and investment. And I think there's still an awful lot of work to do to help business to understand the criticality of the issue, but also crucially how best to take action. And I guess what's even worse is that we don't really have the luxury of time. It took decades really to establish that case for climate and to galvanize business action, government, etc., and to really win that argument. But we don't really have that same time with nature. We really need to get going now. And we know that as you said, what gets measured gets done, but we don't yet really have those firm metrics, international standards, science-based targets, etc., for nature. And I think the task of business now is really to work on how we make progress, how we build on our lessons learned from the climate challenge, and how we build on those efforts and to build a much more nature positive world and economy, even as we await some of those shared measures and standards. And I might just close with repeating what I heard the great conservationist Henri Sala say earlier this week when someone asked him this question around why should business care about nature? And he said beautifully and very simply, it's simple. There are no businesses on the moon. And I think that really resonated with me and kind of brought to life the challenge here. So I think really this should matter to business, because that is a simple truth. Business relies on nature and we're very much embedded within nature.
Okay, thank you. Probably soon will be businesses on the moon the way the billionaires are going. But just looking at your survey, 7% using advanced solutions. What sort of companies were actually leading the way on this?
I think we're seeing companies across the board trying to get to grips with the types of solutions that can help them, not just to meet their climate goals, but also to create a much more nature positive future. So I think we see particularly in some of the obvious sectors around utilities and resources, for example, where the impact on nature is really very evident. I think we've seen some of the water companies, for example, in particular, making great strides in terms of deploying nature-based solutions. We engaged, in addition to the UN study, we recently worked with the UK Council for Sustainable Business to really help make, nature positive the next net zero. I think, Rain, you mentioned the Get Nature Positive movement, and that really reflected that stat that we saw in the UNGC study, that very few business leaders are really mature in their thinking on this topic. They were all really at the beginning of the journey, and we all really need to make it our job to learn more about our business and where the impacts across our value chain occur, and then what we can do about it. And so what we've tried to do with the Council for Sustainable Business and sponsorship from DEFRA is really look across key sectors and industries where impacts are significant, like fashion, tourism, some of the resources companies, to really work out who are the leaders, what are the sorts of things that they're doing to inspire others, not to pretend to have all the answers, not to pretend to be perfect about it, but to really set out some very tangible and practical advice on actions that business can take now, and trying to make that sort of all the way from really getting started, keeping pace with developments in this space, right through to making some bigger kind of infrastructure investments to really help move the needle on nature positivity. But I think the overall headline is that the reality is that it's a much more nascent agenda, and I don't know that we really have across any industry all of the answers, and we need to kind of work collaboratively and honestly and transparently to try and collaborate to generate those solutions.
We've made such little progress. Are you still with us, Camilla? No, she's been cruelly cut off. She mentioned tourism there. I don't know if she can hear us or not. She mentioned tourism there. I just read a very interesting little snippet from the Architects' Journal, who have been running a campaign to get the government to clamp down on the amount of materials that go into buildings, and particularly to stop knocking down old buildings and building new ones because of all the carbon embedded in the, or embodied, whichever word you like to use, embodied in the making of the steel and the cement for these buildings. And really interestingly, Michael Gove, the Housing Secretary, has just rejected a bid to build a structure called the Tulip near the Gherkin in London, which was a slender column, a concrete column with a lift shaft inside and a tulip shape at the top for a growing viewing gallery for tourists. And one of the reasons he cited was that the amount of embodied emissions wasn't justified by the usefulness of the building. So, I mean, some things are changing, clearly not nature fast enough. Anyway, let's just hear from Chris Dodwell now, who's Head of Policy and Advocacy at Impacts Asset Management and used to be a UK climate negotiator, and I met him many years ago.
Yeah, it's great to be here, Roger. Thanks very much. I guess the question I'm pondering is one that you probably ask us in a minute, which is, well, why is a business going to start caring about nature now? They maybe have been looking at their kind of net zero journey, but why should we be distracted by nature now? And I guess the answer to that question lies simply in the science. So you do not solve for halving emissions by 2030 unless you address nature. The Energy Transitions Commission's recent report that looked at this 20 gigaton gap that we've got between the NDCs that are out there and where we need to be, a third of the emission savings that they identify come from us halting deforestation effectively. So we can't afford not to care about nature. I think one of the things, as a sort of former negotiator, one of the things that really was difficult about this for a country like the UK was lack of agency. I mean, these forests are not largely in our territory. Our impact on them is pretty invisible. It's through the consumption of products and participation in global trade. So how can you take those actions? So that kind of is the first kind of issue that sort of strikes us. You've got to do something, but what do you do? The other reason why you want to take action is risk. So we've talked about the dependencies, we've talked about the amount of global GDP that is potentially liable. We've also witnessed over the last 2 years what happens when humanity and nature start to coexist too closely together. You get the risk of zoonotic diseases that we quite literally can bring a global economy to a standstill. And that is only going to increase in frequency the more that we infringe and our economic development comes at the cost of nature. So you actually have some pretty major risk factors there. The other risk that you've got is that as policymakers start to focus on this issue, if you're a business that is having major impacts on nature, you are running a risk of what that transition looks like and when the policies start to become effective. So you've got a bunch of things there. You've got a kind of, there's no choice, we've got to do it for climate. We have some major systemic risks, and also you potentially have some really serious risks in your own supply chain that you're not aware of. And I guess the reason why we need to act now is actually the consensus, I would say, that's almost been shown at Glasgow about the importance of tackling this topic. So, Roger, you'll remember, this isn't the first time countries have committed to stopping deforestation. I think we were meant to have halved deforestation by now and then, completely finish it by 2030. Well, we haven't halved it, but yet we've committed that we're going to halt it entirely by 2030. But I think what's different this time is we have We have the companies that are committing to this as well. So you've got 12 of the largest companies that are involved in the soft commodity trade that actually are damaging the forests, are saying they're going to take action. We've got financial institutions. So we've got 30 countries that have committed, 30 financial institutions have committed to getting rid of deforestation within their portfolios. And we've got 130 countries that have signed up to the Glasgow Declaration on Forests and Land Use, including those responsible for 90% of those forests. Plus, even the surprise from last night of the US-China declaration has collaboration in that on halting illegal deforestation. So the tricky thing is, well, what are the policies that are going to get us there? And Rain touched on this earlier on. I think we haven't really known how to tackle this problem. It's not like simply placing a price on carbon or identifying the power sector and kind of trying to develop renewables there. This is largely our impacts on nature are due to complex global supply chains, in particular around food, that involve globally traded commodities. So if you stop deforestation in one country, but it costs more to buy product from there, people will just go and source the product from somewhere else that has laxer standards. So what I think the UK has done that's really been effective this time around is this, it's called the FACT dialogue, Food, Agriculture, Commodities, Trade Dialogue. And they've got more than 28 governments that represent 75% in global trade in these commodities who are going to work together on putting deforestation into their deforestation-free supply chains. And I think that focus on trade, the focus on looking at producer and consumer countries, so if you've got Indonesia and China talking about how they can eliminate deforestation from palm oil trade between those two countries, I think we've got a kernel of a chance here that we need to push forward with. And one other thing I'd probably like to say is what we're doing at Impacts about this. So Impacts, we're an asset manager that focuses entirely on the opportunities arising from a sustainable economy. So we manage about £35 billion worth of pensioners' money. And we put this into our system in 3 different ways. So the first thing is we try to identify a universe of companies that are going to do something positive for these issues. So we spent some time over the summer looking at a taxonomy of what are nature positive activities and which are the companies that are delivering those. And then those effectively form companies that we want to invest in. Second one is when we're then screening the individual companies, we apply pretty strict proprietary ESG tests. So we're already looking to eliminate deforestation from any of the companies that we're investing in. And what we now want to do is share those lessons with other investors through coalitions that we've signed up to at Glasgow. And then the last thing is we engage with companies directly. So I think that engagement and getting companies to look into their supply chains to understand where they're running risks around nature and deforestation is going to be a really vital part of this activity.
Isn't part of the problem that a lot of the activity is ad hoc activity by peasant farmers, very difficult to track the actions of 1,000 or 10,000 or 100,000 chainsaws across something like the Amazon? There may not always be big business involved, and there may be there certainly will be lax supervision, there almost certainly will be corruption, there will be desperation, poverty, all those drivers. And I'm just wondering, with what we saw the other day, perhaps we should be rather pessimistic about whether or not those goals can be achieved.
I think you're right to raise the challenges. We've already touched on some of the improvements in data. I think satellite monitoring data is now available. I've lost track of the number of people who've come up to me at this COP and spoken to me about what metrics they've got that now allow you to assess the quality, the biodiversity of different systems, whether it's soil DNA sampling that allows you to tell how many species are actually living in an area, or acoustic monitoring was one I heard about this week, where they can actually go into a rainforest and use AI and an acoustic noise gathering to assess the number of species that are there. So the monitoring I think we can do, but you're absolutely right. This is a very diffuse set of actors. The same issue goes for agriculture. Globally, agriculture is a really tricky thing to deal with because of the number of different actors. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't try and we shouldn't bring all of our ingenuity to solving that issue and to considering how you can give people the right incentives to leave the forest standing and to operate around it. There are some great success stories. Actually, I think I saw one on the Earthshot Prize the other day around Costa Rica and the efforts they've done. So if we've got success stories like that, that's what we need to be looking to scale up.
Okay, thank you. We're now going to hear from Angela Francis. At least I hope we're going to hear from Angela Francis from WWF. Angela, are you there?
Hi, Roger. Yeah. Hi, Roger. I can hear you.
Good. I think we can hear you fine. What do you want to tell us?
Well, I thought I should come and say a little bit about biodiversity and nature loss and what it is as WWF, but I am the economist in the team rather than the scientist, so you'll get a shortened definition from me, which is probably good. But yeah, just to say, it's great, first of all, that CBI are putting on a number of events. I know this is a number of events that they're doing on nature and biodiversity, because I think it's the kind of forgotten issue sometimes, and it's great that it's featuring so highly in CBI's COP programme. So starting with a couple of sort of definitions first and the level of threat. So biodiversity, it's the variety of plants and animals and the health of the populations and the uniqueness and the rarity of those species. And nature loss that we're experiencing is the average of 68% of those wildlife populations we've lost since 1970, and it's been driven by deforestation, which has been mentioned, but also by intensive farming and overfishing. And the problem with this is we're losing the habitats, we're also losing the assets that are going to help us mitigate and adapt to climate change. So we're losing the things that can actually be a solution to the problem. And we need to think about new ways of doing things, and it's the variety of species and plants, and the variety and dealing with knowledge and the knowledge we need to how to work with nature and those ecosystems is what we need to get out of this mess, and we're losing it. So I think one of the interesting things from an economist point of view is how the complexity and the richness and the diversity of the systems we work in is going to be that next economic revolution, a green industrial agricultural revolution that we're going to need to go through. And I think one of the things that's interesting is for a lot of the people who are involved in climate work, maybe nature, and I would also add a just transition as being another thing that feels like an extra complication. It feels like something that's going to slow down our path to net zero. And I think you can make a really good argument that it's exactly the opposite. A really good argument that actually thinking about nature and thinking about fairness is going to help avoid all the false routes, and we'll actually get to net zero quicker and we'll get better outcomes. So we know that we waste time if we send really confusing messages to people and to investors about promoting a climate change solution that doesn't make sense for nature. And we know that we fail to create trust and confidence in markets if we don't deliver things fairly. So thinking about these issues, which feel like add-ons up front, is really helpful. So the stories that we will all be familiar with is the experience probably within the last 10-15 years where biofuels really sort of took off as a potential option, but they were replacing food production and putting people at risk of losing their access to food. And then we had a set of taxes in the UK which were incentivizing diesel cars, but they gave us worse air pollution. And we were being led by one metric, carbon, of course, incredibly important. But if it doesn't help you if we try and reduce carbon in ways that just run us straight into the next environmental boundary. And it's the same sort of thing on fairness. We've had in France, the Gilets jaunes protesters worrying about the price of fuel, quite rightly, and we've seen in the UK, decades of unemployment that came from the way we closed mines and left areas that were, blighted with years of unemployment. So that's an example of doing an industrial transition badly, and you also get stuck because you get protests or you get real concerns from the public. So how do we do this better? And so the solutions I think are interesting, and the ones that businesses are going to be interested in are the ones where you get public support and you attract investment by finding out something that works for climate and nature, and you're building a policy proposition or a business proposition that's fair. So as a number of people have said, green food and farming is really important in this. I could talk about trade all day. That's where I spend most of my time, but I won't do it too much. But getting things that feel fair in terms of trade as we move forward is really important. We in the UK produce 52% of our food, but we buy 48%. So working out how we're going to trade and make sure that we're supporting the farmers who are serious and active in moving towards sustainable food systems rather than the people who are backmarkers and not moving their systems is really important. So the things that I think we're trying to change and then trying to incentivize are dealing with a food system that's responsible for 30% of greenhouse gas emissions. Yeah, that's the carbon bit, but also 50% of terrestrial and 70% of freshwater biodiversity loss, all while we've got a system where some people are obese, some people are going hungry, and the whole system is incredibly vulnerable. We're relying on 5 animals and 12 plants for 75% of our calories, and half of all the farmland is degraded and it's underperforming. So there's lots to fix in the food system. And if we just look at it through one vector of carbon, we miss all those other things. So WWF is, we've got a major focus on fixing the food and farming system. We've always seen it as this twin crisis of nature and climate. And one of the things that we're asking for at COP, and we'll see how we're doing on the text on that, is to get all countries to include land use, agriculture, and nature-based solutions in their NDCs, so we don't end up with missing the opportunity to make sure carbon and nature is contributing positively to how we mitigate, adapt, but also restore nature in what we hope is going to be a decade of action that follows COP.
Okay, thank you. I mean, it may be cruel of me to remind you. In fact, it may be so long ago that you weren't involved, but I think in the first instance, WWF were very supportive of biomass when it was first proposed, and it took quite a long time. Took quite a long time for environment groups to twig that actually, we're demanding the land for timber, for wood to burn, for wood to use for fibres, for biodiversity purposes, for watershed purposes, and all these different actors are claiming the same amount of land, saying, "See, there's plenty of land for us," and there is, because they're quadruple counting it.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really good point, and I think we've all learned from some of those early kind of what felt like silver bullet solutions that we need to understand how these things work together. So I wasn't around at that point, but I can well imagine that we went through that process as WWF of looking at how this worked and then trying to do the kind of scientific calculations and the arithmetics to see what it would look like in each geographies, and realizing that we were, compromising food production or compromising land that would need to be set aside for nature. By putting biofuels at such a big contribution to mitigation. So one of the things that we talk about now in WWF is a triple challenge that particularly does that calculation of, we need to have land for food for 10 billion people. We need to have land for nature, and that's probably 30% of our land needs to be set aside for nature, and we need to have land that's providing for climate solutions. So this is all part of it, and nature-based solutions is one of the things that maybe feels like it's in danger of falling into that same category, Roger, like a buzzword which is seen as a solution to everything, and it's afforestation and peatland restoration. Mangroves and coral reefs, these are all really critical, but they're not a get out of jail free card for sectors who need to make emission cuts. It's actually they're a part of a business transition. I think this is the way that Chris was referring to it. They're not just offsets. I like to think about nature-based solutions as being the core business assets, how the sectors that are related to those issues need to invest in them to make a transition to the green economy. So if you're in flood or storm surge management or water quality, peatlands and mangroves and trees alongside rivers, that's not an offset for you, that's your core business. Similarly, if you're a farming and food business, if you're producing in a way that's damaging the soil and polluting the rivers, that is operationally a dead end, but it's also missing the opportunity to be farming sustainably and maybe farming alongside getting carbon credits and doing other things that will be supported by regulation and supported by other financial incentives. So that becomes core business for farming. So the way that is interesting to think about this, I think, is how we go from what was the industrial revolution that we saw in agriculture in the 50s and 60s, where we increased agricultural production by doing what was called a green revolution at the time, which applied industrial thinking to land, where we just reduced variation, focused on a few main crops, poured on the fertilizer, poured on the pesticides, grow it fast, grow it cheap, repeat, that kind of model where we degrade the soils, produce even stronger pests and diseases, found out later that it was bad for the climate and bad for biodiversity. And now we need to go through that process again and go through another revolution, which we think will lead to something more like regenerative farming, where you get farming that works with local ecosystems, farming that produces that requires fewer harmful pesticides, and it's about probably using some of the things that people referred to there, like using data and technology, so that we can actually manage a much more complex system that's got planting and different rotations in it, more mixed farming, and looking at how that's giving us other ecosystem service benefits alongside the food. And that's a better model, I think, importantly, for farmers in the global south and the global north, because it relies on the knowledge management and the expertise of the farmers who are managing a land in a particular ecosystem in a particular way, rather than being a kind of a cog in a wheel where everybody does the same thing and it becomes a low knowledge bit of the supply chain. It's actually a very high knowledge bit of the supply chain. We need to put a lot more effort in that. So our work, if I just finish by saying the incentives that the WWF is working on to get that regenerative agriculture, is really looking at what can we do with the buyers, what can we do with agriculture policy, what can we do with finance. So on the buyer side, that's you and me, but it's also the supermarkets who buy on our behalf. And Rain mentioned earlier the announcement that we've had from Co-op and from Tesco's and Sainsbury's, Waitrose and Marks and Spencer's, who are all leading the way on halving the impact of the food sector by 2030. And that's hugely significant because that reaches 50% of shoppers. And I'm going to let Anna say more about that because she's a big part of the team that were working on that announcement. But that's enormous because it starts to move the whole sector. On policy, the UK has set out, it's got this new framework to reward farmers with public money for public goods. Fantastic. But WWF is also working to sort of show what that looks like. So we're working in Wild Ingleborough, that's the project name, in Yorkshire Dales, to restore uplands, to look at what does a landscape that's rewarded for other commodities alongside farmland actually look like when you can restore a natural tree line and have broadleaf forest and moorland on a piece of land that was otherwise, relatively marginal farmland. And on the supply chain and trade side, we've seen the announcement at COP that you've all mentioned, which was the Glasgow Declaration on Forests, which came out of the FACT dialogues, hugely important. And we need to make sure that's delivered, of course, because there have been failures before. But what WWF also wants to ensure that trade policy is supporting sustainable agriculture, because that's the driver for deforestation. We don't take away deforestation by just stopping deforestation. You have to start the sustainable agriculture that will replace the kind of slash and burn agriculture we have at the moment. And the signs on trade policy are not so good yet. The deal that the UK is proposing with Australia is currently sending all the wrong signals, and we've got a lot of work to do on that. But the fact that the FACT dialogues are there and that producers are moving, I think shows that trade policy needs to move. So there's lots of exciting opportunities on that. And I really predict that trade is going to be one of those discussions that we see at every COP from now on, because everybody's going to be wanting to answer that question. How do you drive a global transition to green agriculture and look at things that really affect nature when countries are all moving at different rates and they're regulating or taxing environmental harms at a different rate or not at all in some cases? And trade's got an enormous power to kind of hinder or help the acceleration of that process. So yeah, lots of exciting opportunities. I think one of the things for businesses will be how they can get on the front foot and look at how they can have climate solutions that also work for nature and find ways of delivering benefits for the people who need them most. And that's farmers often at the sharp end, the communities who are living in the rural areas, and creating healthy food options, because that's where policy and finance should be supporting, because those are going to be the solutions that get us there rather than run us into a dead end.
Okay, thank you very much. Would you say you were passionate about economics in your early teens?
I wasn't going to say this because I might out-nerd Rain on this, but I was like a 12 or 13-year-old watching Newsnight and deciding I needed to learn economics because I was such a deep green teen. I was like, I need to be able to get on Newsnight and argue from an economic perspective why this is all wrong, because this is. So I might be even nerdier than Rain on that one. I'm getting a thumbs up.
Thank you very much. We're now going to hear from Karen Ross, Secretary of the California Department of Food and Agriculture, presumably come here for the COP, I guess.
Yes.
Yeah. Over to you.
So following that and following all of you, I'm not sure what's left to say, except that I do agree that the focus on farmers and ranchers is critically important for all the reasons that have already been stated. And it's critically important because food and ag has become such a high-profile challenge, and oftentimes farmers feel accused of things and that they're bearing the responsibility for many, many, many actions. And yet, this presents the opportunity to empower farmers as problem solvers on a day-to-day basis to really lead on restoration and preservation, and especially on conserving biodiversity. Crashing ecosystems mean we cannot produce food. We have to have healthy ecosystems. We've learned a lot about our built environment over time, and California is a perfect example because of our water systems, as an example. We've learned through that built environment of what the impacts are, and once you have the knowledge, how do you mitigate for that? And Governor Newsom has really challenged us to future-proof California to the extent that it's possible, because we are the state that's been in the global news. Last year's wildfires, I mean, every year is bad. Last year's wildfires, at one point for the month of July, the Central Valley, which produces about 2/3 of the value of our $50 billion farm gate economy, was under clouds of smoke for 30 continuous days. That interferes with photosynthesis. Our droughts, we are now in the worst drought that we've seen since the early 70s, and perhaps a historic drought of proportions that I can't even begin to imagine. That drought will also have a huge impact on our ability to produce. It is causing our streams to be too warm, and no matter how we're managing our storage systems, we don't have enough cold water for our fish, and no one wants to lose species that way. And yet, California is a biodiversity hotspot. We're one of 36 in the world, and we still have a chance to do everything possible to do that. Listening to all of this conversation, there are several things that have been mentioned, and I think it's really important to talk about that now. One is that it does take this full supply chain. Many times there have been brands that are sourcing and prices everything, and yet we're now coming to a recognition that it has to start at the farm for the health of the entire supply chain. And so having the engagement of the full supply chain with farmers at that table is going to be critically important to identify solutions and the economics of making them work. We have to remember that farmers are there to produce food. And many of the world's farmers, which has been mentioned, are the poorest of us. They also represent families that are malnourished. And so we have to remember that we can't do something that sacrifices food production and nourishment and nutrition. So that's going to be very, very, very important. I think that what we have right now, having nature-based solutions, is bringing people together in a way that I haven't seen. You know, for the last 3 decades, I've watched us just be confrontational and adversarial, and farmers would say, who are these environmental groups? Or why is that banker trying to tell me how to farm? We're seeing more collaboration and partnerships than I've ever seen. We cannot do this alone. It's too complex. It's extremely complicated, and we have to take everyone's expertise to come to that table and identify a shared pathway forward. And that's what we're seeing in our Central Valley right now. We know we're going to have to fallow farmland because of our water situation. And yet, it's the Nature Conservancy, it's Environmental Defense Fund, it's Audubon Society that are helping us map out, if we're going to retire that land, how do we make sure that we get the best wildlife benefits, the best biodiversity benefits, the best groundwater recharge benefits, and renewable energy, solar will probably show up on some of that. And thinking about that whole community, because farming in those counties represents a huge economic driver. Those county boards of supervisors have to think about what's going to compensate for those revenues to keep their services going. So that's why it takes all of us to be at that table and think about it from each perspective, because there is no one single answer. Farming is a biological system, and there's lots of moving parts. So I think it's possible for us to move together. And I'm really pleased to be here on behalf of the governor and my colleagues with the Resources Agency and the Environmental Protection Agency. Over a year ago, Governor Newsom stood in an organic walnut orchard of a very good friend of mine to announce our 30 by 30 and our natural working land strategy. We just released our natural working lands climate smart strategy for public comment several weeks ago, and we will have our 30 by 30 where we're making a commitment to save 30%, preserve, conserve, protect 30% of our land mass and 30% of our coastal waters by 2030. We feel that with the inventories we have now, we're about 24 to 27% on the landmass part. So what we need to do is prioritize the most pristine lands that we really don't want to have impacted. That really should be number one, because we need to save as much of that as we still can. And then it's mitigating, restoring. I will use an example of our rice growers in the Sacramento Valley. They had to get rid of burning their rice straw. And one of the solutions they identified is winter flooding of their rice fields, which became man-made wetlands, which is right in the heart of the Pacific Flyway. So now, every winter, they're the hotel and good restaurant for over 300 bird species. That's been incorporated and integrated into rice farming. They are now trying to do the same thing by breaching some of their levees for fish, because they figure if we can do that for birds, let's do this for fish. That's the power of bringing some of our nature-based conservancies together with our rice farmers to solve a problem like that, one at a time, but working all together. Those are just a few examples of what we're doing. I want to close. We do have very ambitious climate-smart ag programs in the state. We're making considerable investment in reducing our carbon footprint and achieving our carbon neutrality goal. But in ag in particular, we're trying to do a better job of quantifying the co-benefits. When we invest over the next year and a half, $160 million in healthy soils, we know that's bringing co-benefits. And it's important that we count that and not just do it to the exclusion of improved nutrient cycling, water holding capacity, which in a dry, arid place like ours is really important, and biodiversity, because a fourth of the biodiversity is in that soil. And if we don't reinvest in our soil and feed our soil, it will no longer feed us. Sorry, I'm going to stop now.
Thank you. So when you talk about retiring land, how does that land get retired? And how do the owners of the land get persuaded to retire it?
In many cases, we have established groundwater sustainability agencies, and part of that is going to be demand management, and everyone will have what they have. And so in many cases, the landowners themselves will make a decision what they're going to fallow and where the highest and best use. As an economist, my friends who are economists, that's important, that every drop is going to the best and highest use.
So that would be, let me just follow this through logically. So that would be for the driest land. So the driest land would get retired, but that also would be the most susceptible to forest fires, no?
No. And the valley floor, where the vast amount of farming happens in California, we have what are called white spots, which they have depended historically on the delivery of surface water from our storage systems and the canal system that delivers that. They don't have access to groundwater. Those are most likely the places that will be up first. There will be landowners that will decide, I have X crops, and I'll be the first one to say it because it gets carried in the news all the time. Our permanent crops, our specialty crops, tree nuts, specialty citrus, vineyards, where they're going to save the water from some of their land to dedicate to those, because huge capital investment. It's a specialty crop that's not grown in other places around the world. Those will be the kinds of decisions they'll make. But what we have to have at the table as the environmental justice community and the folks who represent disadvantaged communities where their groundwater will be impacted for drinking water purposes. So that's where there is a role for the public sector at the local level and the state level to balance these competing needs, to weigh in on some of those decisions. And we have $50 million available to us for multi-benefit land repurposing to really think through how can we achieve other benefits and really optimize the opportunities for wildlife, for biodiversity, it could be a carbon bank, it could be that groundwater storage bank, because of recharging our groundwater is part of our solution going forward. Sorry, I got us a little bit off.
No, just go to the fires thing if you would, because people in the audience here and listening in would have seen California aflame last year, and indeed earlier this year as well. We have a temperature rise at the moment globally of 1.1 Celsius, maybe 1.2. Looks like it's going well over 2. How on earth is California preparing itself for this, and what do you expect?
So part of our challenge has been the resources for what the state can impact, and a huge amount of our forest land in California is controlled by the federal government. So some of the proposals that have just recently passed will reinvest in forest health and stewardship. We've been spending over the last several decades more money on fighting fires than we are on the forest health, and really looking at stewardship and learning from Native Americans who have managed these lands forever. I mean, the practices of indigenous people are also an important part of this puzzle moving forward. So the governor has invested over $6 billion that we've set aside for our role, and we've asked the federal government to match that. And we're also making funds available for those lands that are small landholders that own those forest lands, to make sure that they are also participating in forest health and good stewardship to be able to bring some resiliency for our future.
Okay, well, good luck with that.
I know.
Sorry, that sounded more sarcastic than it meant to. We didn't mean to sound that way.
Oh, I didn't take it that way.
Good luck then. So, Anna Turrell, Head of Environment for Tesco, you're going to fill in a bit more of what Angela was saying and talk to us about the supermarkets doing with the Nature project.
Yes, happy to. Thanks, Roger, and lovely to be with everyone today. Yeah, I guess I'm the kind of the voice of business proper, if you like, on today's panel. And so I'll start by just echoing a lot of what's already been said. I think we're having these discussions now at a really important time, but we are very much at the start of the journey. Let's be under no illusions about that. As a food company, albeit as a retailer and at the end of the value chain, we are acutely aware of the role that nature and biodiversity play, not only to the long-term sustainability and continuity of our business, but also in terms of the impacts the business has on the natural world in just existing and serving our customers every day. Which is also why, and I think it's important that we don't lose sight of this point that's already been made by fellow panelists about climate and nature being two sides of the same coin. I think it's really helpful framing, and I'll come on to why, because I think it's going to help us as businesses as we start to embed and deepen the understanding about the role of nature and biodiversity, to businesses and businesses to nature and biodiversity. But big picture, I mean, we are, as I say, and Camilla's well articulated this point, it's a very nascent topic. So whilst we are starting to get our arms around understanding the scale of the impacts that the food industry has on the planet, such as these, big, quite scary statistics, such as, the fact that we're responsible globally for 60 to 70% of biodiversity loss. That's horrifying. We are kind of absorbing this understanding and realization whilst at the same time being part of an incredibly complex global system that requires kind of systemic changes and transformation that as one company we can't do it on our own, right? And I know that often gets used by businesses in response to kind of challenges, but it's fundamentally true. I mean, Tesco may be the UK's largest retailer, but we are not going to solve the problem of deforestation in Brazil, for example. So what does that mean in terms of the approaches we have to take? Well, it's already been said, we have to work collaboratively, we have to work pre-competitively. And I think what's really encouraging to see is we are starting to see businesses, particularly leading businesses, do that much more. But we, undoubtedly, we need to see much more of it at scale right across the piece. Now, in order to facilitate that pre-competitive collaboration, we do need really strong enabling government support, policy, regulation, legislation. At the moment, and this applies, I would say, across the environmental spectrum, including on climate, what you're starting to see is leading businesses are actually moving at a much quicker pace than government regulation or legislation is able to keep up. And then we need to address that speed issue, because it's going to get us nowhere fast. One good example, I think, that came up just over the last week at COP was the announcement from the Consumer Goods Forum, which we're a member of, around the landscapes ambition announcement. Now, that's a piece of work that Tesco is co-leading with PepsiCo. And it brings together 20 of the world's largest brands and retailers effectively to rethink how we work together in production landscapes. So in the commodity supply chains that we are sourcing from globally across palm oil, soy, pulp paper, as well as beef, and actually starts for the first time to really think about what is really in focus. And so for us, this is about how we transform those production landscapes with a key focus on nature, climate and people, very much around how we work together as businesses, but in partnership operationally with folk on the ground to make sure that we are not trying to put upon nice business ideas or initiatives or philanthropic efforts, but actually fundamentally rethink the way that we work, operate, but making sure that the livelihoods of those growers and producers in the countries where we are sourcing ultimately those ingredients, that they are very much at the centre and informing the solutions that we need to take. So that's one thing that gives me a bit of hope. Obviously, another dimension to it is individual initiatives, and Angela's already mentioned the partnership Tesco has with WWF. Through that partnership, we've, over a couple of years, developed this ambition to halve the environmental impact of the average shopper basket. Now, sounds great, really difficult to do, because again, we are in an open market where, you know, a Tesco shopper, if the price is wrong or they're not interested, can go elsewhere. So whilst we've been working together with WWF in order to frame that basket metric, we've identified 7 different dimensions where we can actually serve to protect and restore nature, as well as obviously looking to address the impacts of climate change. And there are a number of KPIs and metrics that sit underneath that. Again, something that was announced kind of last Friday at COP was that actually we've now kind of been able to, well, WWF has been able to actually expand the coverage of that basket and bring 4 other UK retailers alongside Tesco, so that this isn't just a Tesco thing. We're starting to build that kind of the capability and the engagement across the industry, and that is going to be critical, because unlike some other parts of the food industry, unlike other sectors, you know, a Tesco at the end of the value chain, we don't have integrated supply chains. So our ability to influence and leverage back up into our agricultural supplier bases is mixed, and in some areas pretty limited. So we are entirely dependent on working with other companies, with our peers and competitors, as well as right the way back up the value chain. And whether that's on how we actually, you know, crack the nut of data, which you've already mentioned. Data is an incredibly challenging, tricky topic, or it's about how we build transparency and capacity and capability along the food supply chain to actually start to implement some of these amazing nature-based solutions that we're now starting to talk about. So lots to go after. And then I guess final comment really for me, which kind of links to this point around data. So we've been involved in the development of the Task Force for Nature, the TNFD, for since the get-go. We actually were one of the first companies to sign up to and disclose against TCFD back in 2017. So we've been a kind of an early engager on the nature version. What struck me really quite significantly being involved in the TNFD development process is that there's a lot of goodwill and there's a lot of ambition. There's also a lot of idealism about what we are trying to do and how we do it. But there is still quite a limited understanding about practically how this stuff gets implemented on the ground in these complex, you know, global supply chains. And so, you know, whilst I have a lot of hope, there is just a huge amount more work ahead of us, and we are only going to be able to deliver on it if we work together. And that means, you know, not just business to business, but it's civil society and business, and it's absolutely government needs to be, you know, properly head in the game. So I'll stop there.
I mean, that's a daunting list of challenges you have raised, and constantly through your offering there were suggestions that you're not awfully optimistic about meeting this target or that target, and this is complicated and this is very challenging. I just wondered if you got a good run at this, How many years do you think it would take before we had anything like a sustainable agriculture system that actually looked after nature?
Great question. Don't get me wrong. Don't misunderstand what I think is pragmatism for pessimism, because I genuinely do believe that we actually can get there. It's just that we need to accelerate, and we all need to focus in on the kind of end goal, which is around, we need to build common understanding to get there. I think there are a couple of things here. So the basket metric that WWF and Tesco co-developed, that has a 2030 time horizon on it. So we want to halve the environmental impact of UK shopper baskets by 2030. And the metrics underpinning that basket will serve to hold us to account as individual retailers involved in that, but also help us to understand where we're at in terms of making progress. Now, some areas are going to be easier than others, undoubtedly. This is not a consistent or straightforward race to be in. But I do think what we're starting to see, and it's been a point made by other panelists, is that unlike 24 months ago, we have never seen such a kind of a coalescence around a common growing understanding about not only the scale of the challenge, but also the direction in which the solutions lie. And so I think, and I fully expect that in the 24 months to come, and the proof will be in the pudding, we need to, post this COP, see much more momentum built and maintained. But I genuinely believe that we are going to start to see this. And I think mechanisms such as TNFD, such as government regulation, such as financial markets, investing and really sending strong signals to the business community and elsewhere, that there is only one future that we are all going after. As that starts to build, we'll hit a tipping point, and then I think we'll see an acceleration in progress. The fact that and Chris mentioned it earlier, with the announcement last week around the deforestation commitment, the fact that for the first time you've got the world's largest global commodity traders coming out in support of such initiatives is not insignificant. Now, let's take everything with a pinch of salt, perhaps, but that is not insignificant. We know that things are changing, that the system is starting to shift. I'm not going to try and even attempt to put a timeline on how long that's going to take, but I genuinely believe it's going to quicken the pace as we move ahead.
Okay, thank you very much. Let me take some comments or questions from the auditorium. I've got some on the magic slate if there aren't any. Does anybody want to make a contribution or ask a question? Okay, look, I'm going to take some from the tablet then. So let's start with one from Jim Harbidge. Now, I'm not quite sure who this should go to, so please, panelists, be having a think about whether this applies to you. Isn't the challenge of meaningful improvement on biodiversity just too difficult? How does business access the professional biodiversity skills it needs? And how do they bring these skills into the boardroom with sufficient weight? Good question. Who wants to take that one? Yeah. So
I think you've got a really good spectrum of discussion that we've had here, but it's all been, in one respect, too abstract. We've all said it's really important to have metrics, but no one's actually mentioned a single metric that we would kind of be. The closest we've got comes from our, person who's in charge of food and agriculture, which is brilliant and inspiring. But I think that's the key to getting meaningful engagement, is meaningful about what? So how are we going to hold everyone to account around these pledges that have come through? I think Amanda's absolutely right that TNFD is going to focus on this, but I think that is the big thing for me, is we know it's not carbon as a we know there's not going to be a single proxy like carbon, but there are going to be a finite number of metrics that we all should be focusing on, and we need to have a common language about those, so you're able to hold us to account next year, Roger, and come back and say, you said you were going to make progress, but your indicators are all going the wrong way. So that, I would say, is the key to getting boardroom engagement. And I would challenge myself, and I challenge all of us to actually knuckle down. I mean, we've joined this thing called the Natural Capital Investment Alliance, which is a bunch of investors that want to push for natural capital in a positive way. One of the reasons we've done it is because we want to get together with other members of the industry to work out what we're aiming at and how we calculate and measure progress or failure.
Karen, do you want to comment?
I just wanted to add the issue of capacity building and technical assistance is foundational to any success that we have. We're very fortunate right now. We have a cap and trade market that allows us to reinvest in our transition to this kind of farming, but we're spending some of that for the capital to have the intellectual capacity to help educate farmers, to do demonstrations and trial work with farmers so they can see for themselves how to do this, and then they can go forward carrying those practices forward. We've seen a decline in that kind of technical assistance through a lot of our public universities over the last few decades, and we have to make sure we've got people who are out there working on the ground in the language that's appropriate and the way that farmers learn, which is peer-to-peer learning and demonstration and doing trial work that's very specific to where they're farming. Farming is very geographically specific. And that's an important part at the farm level. That's capacity that we're still investing to build up.
Right. And now to the floor, if anybody wants to stretch your hand up. Is that lady, were you pointing at something? Or
I was going to jump in on that question, Roger. I was going to jump in on that last question, Roger. Is that okay?
Yeah, fine. Okay, the screen's a bit fine. Yeah. Go.
Thank you. I was just going to say, to biodiversity specialism, I think that will certainly come in companies, but one of the things that's interesting to think about is the way it happened in carbon. You didn't have to become a climate expert to know what you needed to do was to reduce your carbon. You had to know how to save energy. You had to know how to make your operations use less resources, and that requires your existing engineers, your accountants, your specialists. Sometimes it's not about understanding the system; it's about understanding your own business. How do you reduce your impact, your land take, your use of nitrates, your fertilizers, your water use? So certainly there will become biodiversity experts, and that will there. But actually, I don't think we need always to become an expert in the outcome. We need to become an expert in our own business and how we change the system so we reduce our impact. And that is probably feels less of a challenge. It's just a different orientation, a different question to ask your engineer, your land manager, and your operations, whatever sector you're in. So I wouldn't overstate the fact we suddenly need loads of zoology specialists working in to solve these problems. I think there's more expertise than we think already in the system.
Yeah, that's a fair point indeed. For Chris/Karen, and from Mr. Anonymous, do the pledges made last week on deforestation make a meaningful difference? And what do we need to look out for to show progress in the next year? Chris?
Yeah, I think they do. I mean, one of the reasons you can tell they're meaningful is because of all of the things that the UK was trying to push on: coal, transport, resilience and finance. This was the one that they went for the World Leaders Summit. This was the pledge that got announced on the second day of the COP, and I think that's because of its importance. But I think now we have to work out what is going to happen in 2022, 2023, every year we're going to have to work out how we're going to make progress on these goals. It's an incredibly daunting task. The number of actors you were talking about, Roger, is, and the number of different types of communities. I actually think...
And Karen made the point about different soils, different geography, different rainfall, different topography.
But I think Karen offers us actually a really good message of hope, because California is a state that embodies so many of these challenges, and you're trying to solve them all together. So I think that's what we need to look to, is how you're balancing up those interests and think about how we can then replicate that at a global scale.
And to do forest health and to do it well, we have to rebuild the infrastructure and the utilization of that woody biomass in a productive way, replacing concrete, whatever it might be. And so we've had a task force really focusing on that. We don't have people who know how to do forest health anymore because we haven't really been doing the stewardship for a couple decades. So that could bring huge economic opportunities to rural communities where there aren't a lot of job opportunities, but we want to do it in the right way. We don't want to build back the way it was. We want to build back better. And that's not just a slogan. We really do believe that in California. It's the California dream.
Okay, so a broader question here, which I'll come to the economists maybe in a moment, but I wonder first if Camilla might like to have a stab at it. There's a couple of questions actually, both to do with economics. Principles of economics, and wondering whether current economic systems can actually deliver the changes that we need. So would you like to offer a thought on that, Camilla?
Unfair to pick on the only person on the panel who isn't an economist and who wasn't passionate about economics as a team. I think we have to have faith that they can, but I think, as people have said throughout the day on the panel, we need to introduce different measures of success and a new language into that kind of accepted and established accounting framework that we operate within. I think one of the things we haven't talked about today, we focused a lot on companies and their operations. I was really excited to hear about what Anna is doing with regards to the consumer, because I think we haven't really spoken about how we change the consumer experience within this kind of economic system and the capitalist system. And I heard several calls to action last week in Glasgow around really putting a bit more onus on businesses to reduce the friction in the consumer experience. And I think we heard that even where consumers want to live sustainably and want to make sustainable choices at that point of purchase, there's a lot of friction, lack of transparency. It's really hard to get your head around whether one product is better than another. Sometimes the sustainable option is a separate option. Sometimes it's less beautiful. Sometimes it costs more. And I think there's a lot of opportunity for business within the current economic construct to carve out, competitive advantage, economic opportunity and advantage in differentiating their products and really making them sustainable by default, and helping the consumers to make the right choice without feeling they're being guilt-tripped into paying more for a sustainable product, or feeling that there's somehow a trade-off in the decisions that they're making when they're seeking to make sustainable purchasing decisions. But I might point to one of the proper economists to comment on the question.
Okay, Rain, we kind of talked about this before as to whether or not the current economic paradigm can deliver a safe biosphere and also a safe atmosphere. And I think you offered some perhaps rather interesting and maybe surprising views for somebody in your position. Would you like to offer some thoughts on that?
Well, I think it's it's a few things. First of all, I think you do need strong regulation, whether that's thinking about how you build homes and making sure they're not just zero carbon ready, but they are actually zero carbon. And of course, in this context, thinking about how efficient are they in terms of water use? What is the construction materials that are used within it? What are the standards we want, and what's the embodied carbon, and where their impact on the natural environment as well. So I think you need strong regulation. I also think that we need to change the way, how we measure success, right? I think, and I'll say this as a macroeconomist, I have a team of very talented economists who will do GDP forecasts, and that is important and plays a role. But I think everyone should have at their fingertips, what are the carbon emissions that the UK produced last year? It's 326 million metric tons of carbon from the latest data in which that's available, and we should be monitoring that as well as our impact on what is the current. The UK does terribly on biodiversity loss because we did our deforestation hundreds of years ago. And I think when people talk about wider economic systems, we do need to think about what's the alternative, and it's a spectrum, right? I don't think we want to return to kind of colonial eras of free market, let's not go down how much, what that did to indigenous people, but also what it did to the planet. But at the same time, and I say this as a student of economic history, under communist systems, we also saw terrible degradation of the environment. So I don't think it's, but what do you need to make it work successfully? You need strong regulation, you need a price on carbon, you need a value for nature, you need nature capital in the way you account for things. And finally, it is about property rights too. And I think one of the things that, and this is a sort of theme I think that's come through various areas, if you really want to protect the natural environment, make sure you give property rights to people who will care for that environment. And you've seen that, if you were thinking about how do we make sure the forests are well looked after, indigenous peoples are sometimes the best guardians of the forest. And we've seen that work successfully in parts of the Amazon where Indigenous people have had more rights over the forest. And you've seen that in fishing, right? Where you've had local fishermen come together within a reserve to say, actually, we own the fishing rights in this area. There's not going to be overfishing because we're going to be the guardians. And so I think it's bringing the communities into the conversation, and particularly the farmers. And we speak for the National Farmers Union. And I think next time in this conversation, we'll make sure they are here too, to be really part of that conversation, because I really think they are the guardians of, this huge transformation we need in our food system. But if we bring the communities into the conversation, it's a farmer, an 80-year-old farmer who I sat beside a couple of years ago, and he said, oh, climate change. And I thought he was going to finish by saying, what's it all about? And he said, I see it every day in the soil. Yeah. He said, I've seen it, when I was a young boy, when I farmed this land, it was so much easier, and now it's really hard, and we've got to do something about it.
Yeah, I mean, you said you grew up in Mid Wales. I spent a lot of my youth in Mid Wales as well, and summers were wet, and the ground was wet. And now summers are dry, and the ground is dry, and there's not enough water for the cattle, and the climate has clearly changed. But I mean, this week, there was Nature Day on Saturday. Apart from that, there's been very little conversation about nature. There's been very little conversation that I've heard about the government's attempts to try to mend agricultural subsidies. I mean, Michael Gove did what I think a lot of people would agree was a really impressive start. But since then, things have ground to a halt, and we still can't see how farmers are going to be rewarded for protecting nature. I wonder if you think is that a fair assessment? I mean, Chris, could you offer an assessment on that?
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to bring in some of the people that are out there, but I mean, I would say there hasn't been a day at this COP when I haven't had someone talk to me about nature. So we've not been in the blue zone. We've been out in the the sort of business innovation zone, and the number of projects that are going on, actually a lot of them in UK and a lot of them in Scotland around rewilding, is really exciting, including some that are kind of sea wilding. There's a great project going on out in Loch Craignish where they're replanting seagrass and bringing natural oysters, and it's being done for the benefit of the local community. They're all the ones that are active in it because they're the people whose loch it is and whose land it is. So this sense of place and community is really important. I think the challenge with that is, how do you develop revenue streams, and how do you develop it at scale? So I think lots of people, and as I said earlier on, a lot of really exciting stuff going on around metrics on nature. So I see those things going on out there. I guess what we need is policy to make it happen at scale. And I think Amanda was talking about this now. We've got to get, we all need to be on the same hymn sheet, talking to policymakers and coming up with the same set of clear asks, and then kind of holding government to account to try to help us deliver it. Because I think business, the ingenuity is there, the ideas are there, the innovation is coming through, Roger.
Yeah, I mean, isn't part of the problem is that there's a lot of stuff we really don't understand. So the issue of soil carbon, for instance, which was barely mentioned a few years ago, has suddenly come out and this is absolutely vital. Yeah. It was staring us in the face, but we didn't see it.
Well, it's methane as well. I mean, methane back to agriculture. And the pledge. Who knew until the IPCC said it that 0.5 degrees of the 1.3 is down to methane. Yeah. So you're absolutely right. These things happen, but then we need to respond rapidly to them. Yeah, I'm sorry. I don't want to take time away from some of the experts.
Does anybody else want to come in on this? Any people on the screen who are faint, blurry? Yeah, Angela.
I'm still faint and blurry, I don't know, but I just wanted to come in on that farming point and the public money for public goods framework. So Roger, I agree, it's really exciting, and I'm not sure if UK government knows how exciting the proposals are. The environment sector nearly kind of sort of started jumping up and down when Michael Gove said public money for public goods. It's actually what the rest of the world needs to do. We need to be changing the agricultural subsidies we have around the world, which are funding pretty much the worst farming systems that you can imagine, to change that around to be funding restoration and new sustainable farming systems. And the UK should make sure that what it's done succeeds. And one of the things that's really worrying is that the farmers who are interested and excited in that are losing faith because bits of the trade system are going in the other direction, and it's making them not feel confident that the direction of travel that they're being pointed in is going to be supported by trade policy, which might undercut them and let UK demand equally support farming, which is high carbon, high methane, plans to continue producing just the same amount of livestock, hasn't got a strategy to get to net zero, and those things need to be consistent. And the UK could really be doing some interesting things as an independent trade actor on this. And ARD is doing some interesting things in the green technology space, but with farming, it just seems to have missed the opportunity to really reinforce the fantastic work we're doing on public money for public goods at home, and the fantastic work we're doing on the fact dialogues to green our supply chains. Trade needs to get in there and start saying this is the direction of travel we're going, and there will be no change, absolutely consistent. You can invest with confidence because that's where we're going, not sort of prevaricating and saying we're equally interested in in letting access to our markets from anybody who's doing any type of farming as long as it's cheap. And it goes back to Rain's point, the question you put to Rain, and Rain's point about the economics of this. The markets we have are not preordained and unchangeable. The markets we have are the markets because we've designed the rules that way. We can change the rules if the outcome we're getting at the moment is not socially optimal. Put in some regulation, put in some taxes, put in some different incentives, and you get a different market. And that's what economics does very, very well, as long as we design it correctly. And economics can also help you with the policy solutions that get you the innovation and get things to come to the market. So the economics can be a solution in this. It's not for us just to sort of say, oh, the markets doesn't work. We can solve that problem. That's within our gift.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to claim a little bit of credit now. Nobody will be able to deny this. For 2 years, I sat opposite Michael Gove when he worked for the BBC, and we used to have lunch 3 days a week in the basement of Broadcasting House, and very often I would be talking about the folly of the European Common Agricultural Policy, which I was interested in from an environmental point of view, and he was interested in from a kind of Brexity, free trade, what's happening with the subsidies point of view. So it was a great joy to me when he popped up and then made an attempt to green the entire UK farming economy. Anyway, nobody can say that's not true because nobody else was there. I'm going to just flip now through everybody. We've got just a couple of minutes left. I just want really just a few statements because we've talked a lot about the complexity and difficulty of this, just to send people out with just a sort of spurt of optimism. So, Camilla, just 3 reasons to be cheerful, briefly.
3 reasons to be cheerful. We're having this conversation. We're investing heavily in new technology and data that will help us to make significant progress on this agenda. And thirdly, in the meantime, we already have technology that works in trees, oceans, soil, etc.
Chris?
I think that we've had a really fresh new approach to the climate negotiations over the last 2 weeks that has broken it down into a bunch of bite-sized chunks that allow us to have a conversation like this about a really important problem.
Congratulations to the UK for that.
Yeah, I do. I think it's kudos to the UK and kudos to the COP team that they did that. I think that we are on the verge of getting understanding around the data and the metrics. We need to define the exam questions much more clearly, and then we can be held accountable. But I'd say it's a bit of hope and a bit of, wishful thinking, stubborn optimism. But I'll steal WWF's line. We got to make sure that every climate promise must be kept, and especially those made about nature.
Okay, Angela, briefly.
So I'll do 2 things. Chris has given me one already. So I think working with nature is actually going to be the best business solution, and businesses are finding that already, and that's great. And I think nature is one of the direct benefits that people feel. And if in the pandemic we have any kind of silver linings, it's been that people have really looked at the value of nature. And if you want to do something that's popular and kind of a way to deliver that people can really feel, they can't feel climate changes immediately, but they can feel nature is being restored around them in parks and green spaces and their natural environment. So governments should get on and do that.
Yeah, popularity, that's an interesting one. Karen, your three reasons to be cheerful?
3. Well, the announcements last week, that methane pledge was huge. just to talk about
The
nature-based.
Chinese have also said that they'll look at methane as well.
That's, I mean, it's such a powerful short-lived climate pollutant, and being able to do that, so that's huge. How many conversations are happening around soils is like, that's the key to productivity and to nature. And the investments that, you know, we are fortunate at the state of California, we're making them. Because of our diversity, I think we can prove out some concepts that could work around the world, and we've got the partnerships to make it happen. Just being able to have a table with everyone there is a huge step forward in finding those solutions.
Thank you. Rain. Oh no, we haven't had Anna. Where's Anna?
Thanks. Three reasons to be optimistic. We're starting to work together in ways that we've never collaborated before, and that's incredibly encouraging. I think we're starting to see the mobilization of levels of finance that we've never seen put to solving some of these big sticky issues. $130 trillion is not a small amount of money. Obviously more to come, but that's really significant. And I think we're all the public socialization of these issues and the deepening understanding of them is so critically important, because by keeping it in the light, then we're able to keep accountability up and on businesses and governments. So if the Daily Mail are starting to talk positively about what we need to do, then that to me tells me that we're moving in the right direction.
Rain, your three reasons to be cheerful and to close the meeting.
Absolutely, Roger. Well, I think first I will start, you know, I'm gonna go back to where I started from. You know, we now have, you know, the UK government commissioning a report by a leading economist which says that nature has to be at the heart of economics, and trying to, you know, drive that systems change that we all want. Secondly, we've just, as Chris was saying, we've really seen how businesses themselves are coming together, and Anna as well, great example of just, you know, how can we solve this in our supply chains? How do we make this happen? There's, you know, there was an alliance of businesses where 10 businesses get and said, we're going to look to improve clean air and make sure that in local cities we have tighter regulations around clean air, because it benefits our employees and our products, and you know, and so it is just sort of happening. You know, and I think that is absolutely vital. And finally, I think we've got better ways of holding businesses and governments to account in a way we didn't have before. And I think we just need to keep it quite simple, make consumers be aware how much water was used in the production of this, you know, in this dress. I think the more that people understand the impact on the natural environment of some of the things that they are buying and what's happening within your own company, we can make better decisions. So I suppose to close, I'm so delighted we're having this conversation. A huge thank you to Scottish Power for hosting us today. A big thank you particular to Camilla at Accenture for bringing us all together, to Shara and Tanya and the CBI team who have, you know, really helped to bring nature at the heart of business. A huge thank you to Karen, to Chris, Roger, I know you had to nip back at one point to see the birth of your grandson, for which congratulations, but it's been great to have your support, and also to Angela and Anna as well joining us online. So thank you everyone, and thanks again, Roger.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ryan.